My mother-in-law left my 9-year-old stepdaughter sitting alone on a park bench at a county fair with a swollen ankle and tears dried on her face while she walked off to ride the Ferris wheel with her other grandchildren. My sister-in-law said she was slowing everyone down on purpose. When my husband found out, when he crouched beside that little girl and saw the ankle puffed up like a tennis ball and heard her whisper, "I'm sorry I couldn't keep up, Mama," he didn't yell. He didn't make a scene in that parking lot. He carried her to the car and he drove home and he didn't say a single word for 14 hours. The next morning, he picked up the telephone and called his mother and his father and his sister on a three-way line, and he said something so quiet and so final that nobody on the other end spoke for almost a full minute. But what happened after that phone call, what it cost his family, what it gave mine, and what a little girl did in a courthouse 11 months later that made a judge pause and a grown man cry for the first time in 30 years, that's the story I've been carrying for 40 years, and I'm going to tell you every word of it right now. My name is Margaret. I'm 72 years old. I'm sitting in a chair that has a permanent dent shaped like my body because I've earned every inch of this seat, and I'm not moving from it. The story I'm about to tell you happened when I was 32 years old in 1984 in a small town in Ohio where everybody knew your name and nobody knew your business, and those are two very different things. I married a man named Walter Briggs. Walter was not the kind of man who made noise when he entered a room. He was the kind of man who made the room quieter because people trusted the silence he carried. He worked at a steel fabrication plant, started as a floor hand, worked his way up to shift foreman by the time he was 30. His hands were rough and his voice was low, and he had a way of looking at you when you spoke that made you feel like the only person on earth who mattered. That's how he looked at me the first time we met. That's how he looked at Rosie the first time he saw her hiding behind my leg at a church picnic. And that's how he looked at his mother the last time he ever spoke to her. Except when he looked at his mother, his eyes didn't say, "You matter." They said, "You're done." But I'm getting ahead of myself because you need to understand Rosie before you understand the rest. Rosie is why everything happened. Rosie is why everything changed. And Rosie is the reason I'm sitting here at 72 years old, telling this story to strangers on the internet, instead of keeping it locked in the drawer where I kept it for decades. Rosie came into my life when she was 7 years old, and I was 30 and single and living in a rented duplex with a leaking kitchen faucet and a cat named Beans, who had one eye and an attitude about it. I wasn't looking for a child. I wasn't looking for anything except maybe a plumber and a full night's sleep. But life doesn't ask what you're looking for. It drops things at your feet and waits to see if you're brave enough to pick them up. Rosie was dropped at my feet by my cousin Linda, who worked for the county child services office, and called me one evening sounding like she'd been crying. "Margaret," she said, "I've got a girl, 7 years old, third placement in 2 years. The current family says they can't handle her." I sat down on my kitchen floor because standing felt like too much confidence for that conversation. "What's wrong with her?" I asked, and I hated myself for the question before it finished leaving my mouth. "Nothing's wrong with her," Linda said, voice sharp. "She's scared. She doesn't trust adults. She hoards food in her pillowcase because she's afraid there won't be breakfast. And every time someone raises their voice, she goes completely still, like a rabbit who thinks if she doesn't move, the hawk won't see her." Linda paused. "She needs someone steady, Margaret, someone who won't quit." I looked at Beans. Beans looked at me with his one eye like he already knew what I was going to say. "Let me meet her," I said. That was a Tuesday. By Thursday, I was sitting in a county office that smelled like floor polish and old coffee, and a little girl with dark brown hair and a sunburn across her nose was sitting across from me holding a stuffed horse with a missing tail. She didn't look at me. She looked at the table. She looked at the door. She looked at her shoes, which were too big for her feet and laced so tight the tongues bunched up like she was afraid they'd fall off if she didn't strangle them. "Hi," I said. "I'm Margaret." She didn't respond. The caseworker gave me an encouraging nod like I was performing and needed a better review. I ignored her and looked at Rosie. "That's a good horse," I said, nodding at the stuffed animal. Rosie's fingers tightened on it. "His name is Captain," she said to the table. "Captain," I repeated. "Does he like carrots?" Rosie looked up for the first time. Her eyes were brown and enormous and exhausted in a way that no 7-year-old's eyes should ever be. "Horses eat carrots," she said. like she was testing whether I was smart enough to know that. They do, I said. My neighbor has a horse named Biscuit, and he eats carrots right out of your hand. You have to keep your fingers flat, though, or he'll nibble them. The corner of Rosie's mouth moved. Not a smile. Not yet. A consideration. Like she was deciding whether this information was worth storing. Does it hurt? She asked. When he nibbles, it tickles more than it hurts, I said. She looked at Captain. Then she looked at me. Can I bring Captain? She said. Wherever I'm going next. You can bring Captain everywhere, I said, and I meant it in the biggest way I knew how. Rosie moved in 3 weeks later. She brought Captain and a backpack and a garbage bag with clothes that didn't fit, and a fear so big it filled every room she walked into. The first night she slept on the floor beside the bed, not in it. I found her in the morning curled up on the carpet, with Captain pressed against her chest and her shoes still on. She'd put her backpack by the front door, zipped and ready like checkout time was coming, and she wanted to be prepared. The second night I put a blanket and pillow on the floor beside the bed, so at least the carpet wouldn't hurt her. The third night she climbed into the bed but slept on top of the covers in her clothes. By the second week she was sleeping under the covers but still in her shoes. By the third week the shoes were off but lined up at the foot of the bed, perfectly parallel, toes pointing at the door. It took 4 months before she stopped lining them up, 5 months before she left them in the living room like a normal kid. 6 months before I tripped over them in the hallway at midnight and whispered a word that Rosie would have found very educational. And I'm grateful she was asleep. She called me Margaret for the first 3 months, then Miss Margaret, then just M. Then one evening in the grocery store, she was reaching for a box of cereal on a shelf too high for her, and she said, Mom, can you get that one? And then she froze like she'd set off an alarm. Her whole body went rigid and her eyes got wide and she pulled her hand back and said, I mean Margaret. Sorry, I meant Margaret. I reached up and got the cereal and put it in the cart and said, Yep, that's me, and kept walking. I didn't make a production out of it. I didn't cry in the cereal aisle even though I wanted to because that child had just given me the biggest gift anyone had ever given me. And she'd done it between the Cheerios and the Frosted Flakes, and I was not going to make her regret it by turning it into a moment she had to manage. Now, if you're watching this and you know what it feels like to hear a child call you something they're not sure they're allowed to call you, and you held it together in public and fell apart in private, drop a comment right now. Tell me about it. Because those moments are the ones that remake your entire skeleton, and most people never get to talk about them out loud. And while you're down there, hit that subscribe button because every story on this channel is for the people who showed up when it was hard and stayed when it got harder. You belong here. I met Walter at a church picnic 7 months after Rosie moved in. I wasn't looking for a man. I was looking for the potato salad because Linda had told me the Methodist women made it with mustard and dill, and I was skeptical but curious. Walter was standing near the dessert table holding a paper plate with too much pie on it and looking at the crowd with the expression of a man who'd been told to socialize and was doing his best impression of someone who enjoyed it. Rosie was beside me, holding Captain even though she was almost 8 and knew that stuffed animals at picnics were risky business socially. She didn't care. Captain went everywhere. Captain was non-negotiable. Walter noticed us because Rosie was trying to reach the lemonade pitcher, and her fingers were about 3 inches short, and she was stretching on her toes with a kind of determination that suggested she'd rather dislocate a shoulder than ask for help. Walter set his plate down and moved the pitcher to the edge of the table without saying a word. Then he stepped back. Rosie looked at the pitcher, looked at Walter, poured her lemonade. Then she looked at him again and said, You have too much pie. Walter looked down at his plate. She's right, he said to me. I do have too much pie. He didn't crouch to Rosie's level. He didn't offer her candy. He didn't perform warmth. He just stood there like a tree, steady and unthreatening, and let her decide if she wanted shade. That's the thing about Walter. He never grabbed. He just opened his hand and waited. If you came to him, you came because you chose to. If you didn't, he didn't take it personally. He treated every person, especially small ones, like they had a right to their own space and their own speed and their own opinion about pie. Over the next few months, Walter showed up the way rain shows up in a garden, not all at once, not with thunder, just consistently, until things started growing. He came to the house to fix my kitchen faucet because Linda mentioned it to someone who mentioned it to him, and he just appeared one Saturday with a wrench and a quiet hello. Rosie watched him from the hallway like a surveillance camera with braids. He fixed the faucet. He didn't ask to stay for dinner. He said goodbye to Rosie on his way out, and she said goodbye back, which was more words than she gave most adults. And I noticed. He came back the next week to check the faucet. It didn't need checking. We both knew that. Rosie was at the kitchen table doing homework, and Walter sat across from her and read the newspaper and didn't say anything, and didn't try to help, and didn't hover. He just existed in the same room as her without requiring anything from her. After 20 minutes, Rosie slid a piece of paper across the table. It was a math worksheet. Walter looked at it, looked at her. "What's this?" he asked. "I don't understand number 7, she said. Walter studied it. "I don't understand it either," he admitted. "But I think if we read it out loud, it might make more sense." They read it out loud together, and it still didn't make sense. And they both agreed that number 7 was unfair, and Walter suggested they skip it and come back later, which is terrible math advice, but excellent trust-building strategy because Rosie laughed. She laughed. A real laugh that came from her stomach and surprised her so much she covered her mouth like she'd broken something. Walter looked at me across the room, and something passed between us that was bigger than romance. It was recognition. He saw what I was doing with Rosie. He saw the work, the patience, the daily act of being steady for a child who was waiting for the world to betray her again. And he didn't see a problem to solve or a situation to rescue. He saw a family he wanted to belong to. We got married in the spring of 1984. Small ceremony, backyard. Rosie wore a dress she picked herself, yellow with white buttons, and she held Captain during the vows because Walter told her Captain was part of the family and family stands together at weddings. The preacher raised an eyebrow at the stuffed horse but had the good sense not to comment. After we said our vows, Walter knelt down and looked at Rosie and said, "I'm not going to promise to be your dad because that's your decision, not mine. But I'm going to promise to show up every day and keep showing up until you tell me to stop." Rosie stared at him with those enormous brown eyes and said, "Are you going to fix more faucets?" And Walter said, "Probably." And Rosie said, "Okay then." And that was the most binding contract I've ever witnessed in my life. Now, I need to tell you about Phyllis, because this story has a villain and her name was Phyllis Ann Briggs, and she smiled while she cut you and called it love. Phyllis was Walter's mother. She was 58 years old in 1984, and she had the kind of face that looked pleasant in photographs and predatory in person. She went to church every Sunday. She brought casseroles to sick neighbors. She volunteered at the hospital gift shop. And she divided the world into two categories, people who belonged to her and people who didn't matter. Her husband Earl was in the first category, but only technically. Earl was a retired machinist who'd been agreeing with Phyllis since 1952 and showed no signs of developing an independent thought. He sat in his armchair and watched baseball and said yep whenever Phyllis paused long enough to require confirmation. Earl wasn't cruel. He was empty. The kind of empty that lets cruelty happen because stopping it would require effort, and effort would require caring, and caring was something Earl had outsourced to Phyllis decades ago. Then there was Darlene, Walter's sister, 2 years younger, twice as loud, and the undisputed favorite child in a competition that had been rigged from birth. Darlene married a man named Keith who installed swimming pools and had the conversational depth of one. They had 2 kids, Tommy, who was 10, and Beth, who was 7, and these children were the center of Phyllis's universe. Tommy could break a window and Phyllis would call it athletic. Beth could throw a tantrum in a restaurant and Phyllis would call it spirited. They were her blood grandchildren. They were the real ones. And Rosie, from the moment Phyllis laid eyes on her, was the other one. The first family dinner at Phyllis's house happens 3 weeks after the wedding. Walter warned me. "They're going to be weird about Rosie," he said, like he was predicting weather. "I'll handle it." He didn't handle it because you can't handle a woman like Phyllis. You can only survive her or remove her. We hadn't learned that yet. We walked in and Phyllis opened the door with a smile so wide it looked surgical. "There's my boy," she sang, pulling Walter in. Then she turned to me and the smile reduced by approximately 40%. "Margaret," she said, like she was reading my name off a form. And then she looked down at Rosie, who was holding my hand and holding Captain with the other, and Phyllis's smile didn't disappear. It reclassified. It became the smile you give a neighbor's dog when it wanders into your yard. Tolerant, temporary, not welcome to stay. Oh, she said, you brought her. Not hello, Rosie. Not welcome, sweetheart. You brought her. Like Rosie was a dish I'd carried in that nobody ordered. Inside, Tommy and Beth were already installed in the living room like furniture that came with the house. Phyllis had set out cookies for them. She poured them juice in special cups. Beth was on Earl's lap getting her hair braided, which was the most active I ever saw Earl in any context. When Rosie walked in, nobody moved. Nobody offered her a cookie. Nobody said hi. Tommy looked at her and said, "Who are you?" Rosie said, "I'm Rosie." Tommy said, "Are you adopted?" Rosie looked at me because she didn't know how to answer that question, and honestly, neither did I, because the paperwork wasn't finished yet, and the truth was complicated, and a 10-year-old boy in a living room wasn't the venue for that conversation. Walter stepped in. "Rosie is family," he said simply. Tommy shrugged and went back to his cookie. Beth ignored her entirely. Phyllis watched the whole exchange from the kitchen doorway, drying a plate she'd already dried, and she didn't correct Tommy. She didn't welcome Rosie. She just dried that plate and watched like she was studying a problem she intended to solve later. At dinner, Phyllis asked Tommy about his baseball team. She asked Beth about her dance class. She asked Walter about work. She asked me nothing. She asked Rosie nothing. Rosie sat quietly eating mashed potatoes with her fork held too tight, her eyes tracking the conversation like she was measuring the distance between herself and everyone else, and the number kept getting bigger. At one point, Rosie said quietly, "I like baseball too." Phyllis didn't look at her. Darlene snorted and said, "Well, you're a girl, so." Keith laughed because Keith always laughed when Darlene was mean, because Keith thought cruelty was comedy. Rosie's fork went still. She didn't say anything else for the rest of dinner. In the car afterward, Walter gripped the steering wheel and said, "I'm sorry, I should have said something." "Yes," I said. "You should have?" He looked at me sideways. It was the first time I'd been that direct with him. "I'll do better," he said. He meant it, but meaning it and doing it are different verbs, and they don't always conjugate at the same speed. The pattern continued. Sunday dinners, holiday gatherings, birthday parties for Tommy and Beth, where Rosie received no invitation but was expected to attend anyway, because family is family, and Phyllis loved saying that phrase like it was a shield she could hold up while she stabbed you behind it. Each time, the same choreography. Tommy and Beth received. Rosie observed. Phyllis performed warmth for her blood grandchildren and performed tolerance for mine. Darlene made comments. Keith laughed. Earl said, "Yep." And Rosie got quieter and quieter until the quiet wasn't peace anymore. It was surrender. One Thanksgiving, Rosie came to me in the bathroom at Phyllis's house and whispered, "Mama, why doesn't Grandma like me?" I knelt down and looked at her face, this beautiful, serious face that had already seen too much rejection for one lifetime, and I said, "Some people don't know how to love everybody the same. It's not your fault. It's never your fault." Rosie thought about that. Then she said, "Is it because I'm not real?" My chest cracked. "What do you mean real?" I asked, even though I knew exactly what she meant because Phyllis had been teaching her that word through 1,000 small exclusions. Rosie shrugged. "Tommy said I'm not a real grandkid." He said his mom told him. Darlene. Darlene had told her 10-year-old son that Rosie wasn't a real grandkid, and Tommy had delivered that message with the casual brutality that children are capable of when adults load them like weapons. I told Walter that night. His jaw tightened so hard I could hear his teeth. He called Phyllis the next morning and told her to talk to Darlene about what Tommy said. Phyllis's response, "I'll never forget it," was, "Well, he's not wrong, Walter. She's a sweet girl, but she's not blood. That's just a fact." Walter hung up. He sat at the kitchen table for a long time. Then he said to me, "I keep thinking they'll change. I keep thinking." He didn't finish the sentence. I sat beside him and didn't fill the silence because some realizations need room to breathe, and Walter was breathing through something that was going to change everything. But Walter was loyal in the way men of that generation were loyal, not because the people deserved it, but because loyalty was identity, and walking away felt like walking away from himself. So he kept going. He kept showing up on Sundays. He kept helping his parents. Every single Sunday, Walter drove to Phyllis and Earl's house and mowed their lawn and cleaned their gutters and fixed whatever needed fixing. and Phyllis never once said thank you. She said finally, or about time, or your father's been waiting. And Walter did it because he was Walter, and Walter showed up. He also sent them $400 every month because Earl's pension barely covered the mortgage, and Phyllis had expensive taste in nothing important. $400 a month for 4 years, that's $19,200. I know because I did the math later when the math started to matter. And if you're still here, and I know you are because we haven't even gotten to the county fair yet, and you can feel what's coming the way you feel a storm before the sky changes, do me a favor, hit that like button right now. Not for me. Not for the algorithm, for Rosie. For every kid who sat at a table where they weren't wanted and pretended the food tasted fine. That like button is for them. Now. The county fair, September 1984. The day everything broke. Phyllis called on a Saturday morning while I was braiding Rosie's hair at the kitchen table. Walter was in the garage sharpening a lawnmower blade because he was going to mow their lawn later that afternoon, because of course he was. Let me take Rosie to the fair, Phyllis said, voice bright as a commercial. Darlene's bringing Tommy and Beth. It'll be fun. I hesitated. Walter came inside, heard the last part, and gave me a look that said, let's try. So I said yes. I said yes because I was 32 and I still believed that people could change if you gave them enough rope. I didn't realize yet that some people use that rope to hang you. Rosie was excited. She wore her favorite overalls and her sneakers, and she put Captain in her backpack because she was almost 10, and carrying a stuffed horse at a fair was a line she wasn't ready to cross publicly, but she wasn't ready to leave him home either. She hugged me at the door and said, we're going to ride the Ferris wheel. I said, have fun, baby. Phyllis's car pulled away and Rosie waved from the back seat and I waved back, and I can still see her hand in that window, small and open, trusting me to have made the right choice. Walter and I planned to meet them at the fair at noon. We had errands. We'd grab lunch there. It was supposed to be simple. Nothing about that family was ever simple. We pulled into the fairground parking lot at 12:15. The air smelled like fried dough and hay and diesel from the generators running the rides. Music blared from speakers mounted on poles. Kids screamed on the tilt-a-whirl. Teenagers walked in packs eating things on sticks. We scanned the crowd for Phyllis's white hair and Darlene's loud voice. Found them near the ring toss. Darlene was watching Tommy throw balls at bottles. Beth had cotton candy in both hands. Keith was somewhere, probably installing a pool in his mind. Phyllis stood behind them beaming like a woman in a portrait. Earl was on a bench nearby doing his impression of a man who was present. My eyes swept left, right, behind them, around the booth, down the path toward the food stands. No Rosie. My stomach tightened. Where's Rosie? I said, and my voice came out sharper than I intended. Phyllis turned. Her smile didn't change. She pointed vaguely past the Ferris wheel. Over there somewhere, she said. She wanted to sit down. Her ankle or something. She was making a fuss. Darlene didn't look up from Tommy's throws. She was slowing everyone down, Darlene said. On purpose, like she wanted to ruin the day. My skin went cold even though it was 78 degrees. Walter's hand found my shoulder, and I felt his fingers tighten. Her ankle, Walter repeated. What happened to her ankle? Phyllis waved her hand the way she always waved her hand, like details were beneath her. She tricked on something, she said. A rock or a root, I don't know. She said it hurt and then she sat down and wouldn't move. Phyllis sighed like Rosie's ankle was a personal inconvenience. We had the kids, she added, pointing at Tommy and Beth. We couldn't just stand around waiting. So you left her, I said. Darlene finally looked at me. We told her to sit on the bench by the restrooms, she said, annoyed. She's fine. She's probably just sitting there milking it. Phyllis nodded. She does that, she said. Makes everything about her. My daughter. My 9-year-old daughter who barely spoke above a whisper at family dinners and apologized for existing and slept with her shoes by the bed for 6 months because she was afraid of being sent away. That child was making everything about her. I looked at Walter. Walter's face had gone to a place I'd never seen before, not angry. Past angry, somewhere so calm it was terrifying, like the surface of water right before it breaks. Show me where, he said. Not a request, an instruction. Phyllis pointed again, vague, useless. Walter didn't wait. He walked, Fast. I followed. We pushed through families and strollers and teenagers, and I called Rosie's name into the noise, and the music swallowed it. And I called again, louder, and a woman with a funnel cake looked at me with pity, and that pity almost broke me. We found her on a bench near the restrooms at the far edge of the fairground, where the crowd thinned out, and the music faded into generator hum, and the shadows of the trees made the light go grey. She was sitting alone, completely alone. Her right ankle was propped on the edge of the bench, swollen so badly the sock was stretched tight. Her cheeks had tear tracks that had dried in the sun, and she wasn't crying anymore because she'd run out. In her lap was a cotton candy, half eaten, pink, bought with the $2 I'd put in her pocket that morning just in case. She'd bought it herself. Nobody else had bought her anything. When she saw me, her face did the thing that makes me cry even now at 72 years old. Even now, telling this story in this chair, her face opened up like a window that had been locked from the inside, and she said, "Mama, I'm sorry I couldn't keep up." I dropped my knees on that dirt path so fast my bones protested, and I pulled her into me, and her body was shaking, not from cold, but from the specific tremor of a child who has been sitting alone wondering if anyone is coming, and the wondering is worse than the ankle, and worse than the loneliness, because the wondering is where the damage lives. Walter crouched beside us. He looked at her ankle. He looked at her face. He looked at the cotton candy she'd bought herself because not one adult in her grandmother's care had thought to buy this child a single thing at a fair she'd been invited to as an afterthought. He took off her shoes so gently she barely flinched. The ankle was purple and swollen, and she'd been sitting on it for over an hour in the heat alone. Walter picked her up, one arm under her knees, one behind her back. She wrapped her arms round his neck and pressed her face into his shoulder, and she said, "I tried to walk, but it felt like breaking." She was 9. She'd tried to walk on a sprained ankle because she'd been taught that pain was dramatic, and dramatic was unacceptable, and the only way to be acceptable was to suffer without sound. Walter carried her through the fair, past the ring toss, past Phyllis, who opened her mouth to speak, past Darlene, who rolled her eyes, past Tommy and Beth, who didn't notice because they'd never been asked to, past Earl, who said nothing because Earl had perfected the art of nothing over 40 years of marriage to a woman who did too much of everything except the right thing. Sabrina called out as we passed, "Oh, come on, she's fine. She just wants attention." Walter didn't turn his head. He kept walking. Rosie's face stayed buried in his shoulder. I followed with her shoe in one hand and a rage in my chest so deep it didn't have a sound yet. In the car, I held ice wrapped in a napkin against Rosie's ankle while she leaned into me, exhausted. Walter drove with both hands on the wheel, his jaw working, his eyes fixed ahead like he was driving towards something only he could see. He didn't speak the entire way home. He didn't speak while I cleaned Rosie's ankle. He didn't speak while I wrapped it in an ace bandage we had in the medicine cabinet. He didn't speak while I carried her to bed and tucked Captain under her arm and kissed her forehead and said, "You are not dramatic. You are hurt. Those are different things." He didn't speak while I made tea that neither of us drank. He sat at the kitchen table and he stared at the wall, and his silence was so heavy it had furniture. That night, after Rosie was asleep, I went to our bedroom and Walter was standing at the window looking out at the dark street. I touched his back. He flinched. Not away from me, into himself, like he was holding something so tightly that if he loosened his grip, the whole house would hear it. "She bought herself cotton candy," he said. His voice was raw. "They left her alone with a swollen ankle at a fair full of strangers, and she bought herself cotton candy because nobody else thought about her." He turned to me, and his eyes were wet, and Walter's eyes were never wet, and that's how I knew something fundamental had broken inside him. Not broken like damaged, broken like released. Like a bone that had been set wrong for years and finally snapped into the position it was always supposed to hold. "They're done," he said. "I'm done." The next morning, Walter sat at the kitchen table and picked up the telephone. He called Phyllis first, then Earl, then Darlene. Three-way call. Phyllis answered first, chirpy as a bird. Walter didn't let her finish her hello. "You left Rosie alone at the fair with a sprained ankle," he said. His voice was flat. Not angry flat. Decided flat. The kind of flat that tells you the conversation isn't a negotiation. It's a notification. Phyllis started immediately. "Oh, Walter, it wasn't that serious," she said. Earl coughed in agreement. Darlene jumped in. She was being dramatic as usual. She does this every time we go anywhere. She makes it about her so she can get attention. Walter let them talk. He let them fill the line with excuses and deflections, and the word dramatic appeared 3 times in 30 seconds, like a family motto stitched on a pillow nobody asked for. Then he spoke. She had a sprained ankle, he said. You knew she was hurt. You left a 9-year-old child alone on a bench at a public fair, and you went to ride the Ferris wheel. Phyllis's voice tightened. We didn't know it was that bad. Walter continued like she hadn't spoken. She sat there for over an hour, alone, in the sun. She bought herself cotton candy with $2 her mother put in her pocket because not one of you thought to buy her a drink or a snack or check on her once. Darlene snapped. She's not my responsibility, Walter. She's your situation, not my kid, not my problem. Walter didn't react. He breathed once, slowly, and then he said the sentence that I have replayed in my mind every single year for 40 years. You treated her like she was borrowed, he said. She's not. She's ours. And you just lost both of us. The line went quiet. Not the quiet of people thinking, the quiet of people realizing. Phyllis recovered first. You can't do this, she said. I'm your mother. Then she said the thing that Phyllis always said when she wanted the world to rearrange itself around her guilt. After everything I've done for you. Walter's response was so calm, it was surgical. What have you done for me, Mom? Specifically, because I can tell you what I've done for you. I mowed your lawn every Sunday for 4 years. I cleaned your gutters. I fixed your plumbing. I replaced your porch railing. I sent you $400 every month because Dad's pension doesn't cover the life you think you deserve. That's $19,200 and 1,600 hours of labor, and you couldn't sit with my daughter on a bench for 1 hour. Phyllis sputtered. Darlene started yelling something about disrespect. Earl said, yep, unclear to whom or about what. Walter said 3 more words. We're done here, and he hung up. Then he opened the checkbook. He found the line where he'd written Phyllis and Earl's names every month for 4 years. He drew a single line through it. Then he closed the book and put it in the drawer and looked at me and said that money goes to Rosie now. I sat across from him and I didn't tell him he was making a mistake. I didn't ask him to reconsider. I didn't smooth it over because smoothing things over is what women in my family had been doing for generations, and all it ever produced was a smooth surface over a rotting floor. I said okay, and I meant it like a foundation. The fallout came faster than a summer storm. Phyllis didn't call to apologize. Phyllis called to recruit. Within 2 days, every aunt, uncle, cousin, and church member in a 30-mile radius had received a version of the story where Phyllis was the victim and Walter was the ungrateful son who'd abandoned his aging parents over a silly misunderstanding. Phyllis told them she'd sacrificed everything for Walter. She told them she'd supported him through hard times. She told them Margaret, meaning me, had poisoned him against his own family. She told them the girl wasn't even his, and he was throwing away blood for a stranger. Aunt March called. She's your mother, Walter. Family is family. A cousin I'd met twice sent a card that said reconciliation is godly. Phyllis's pastor called and suggested we meet for mediation, which was rich considering Phyllis had been gossiping about Rosie in the church parking lot for months. Darlene told anyone who would listen that Walter was brainwashed and I was a manipulator, and Rosie was the problem, because if she'd just walked faster, none of this would have happened. Walter listened to one voicemail, and then he set the phone down and said she's not fighting for Rosie. She's fighting for the $400. He was right. Not one call mentioned Rosie. Not one letter asked if she was okay. Not one relative said that child was left alone, and that's wrong. They all said family. They all said forgive. They all said blood. And none of them said ankle or alone or afraid. Walter didn't respond with feelings. Walter responded with facts. He sat at the kitchen table that night and wrote a letter. Not to Phyllis, to every single person who had called or written on her behalf. The letter was 1 page. It listed every Sunday he'd mowed the lawn, every repair he'd made, every month he'd sent $400, the total hours, the total dollars, and at the bottom, 1 paragraph about what happened at the fair. What actually happened, not Phyllis's version. The version where a 9-year-old sat alone on a bench with a sprained ankle while the people who were supposed to keep her safe rode the Ferris wheel. He mailed 17 letters. The phone calls stopped within a week. Not because everyone believed him, because the numbers were undeniable and guilt is quiet when it has nowhere to hide. 2 weeks after the fair, Rosie came home from school and she was different. Not upset different, stiff different. She sat at the table and did her homework and didn't speak, and when they asked how her day was, she said fine, without looking up, which in child language means everything is wrong. I sat beside her and waited. Waiting was something Walter had taught me, not asking. Just being present until the words found their own way out. After 20 minutes, Rosie said, "Grandma came to school today." My blood went cold. "What do you mean she came to school?" Rosie still didn't look up. She came to the office. She told them she was my grandma and she wanted to take me home early. I gripped the edge of the table. "What happened?" "The office lady said she had to check. Then she called you, but you didn't answer. Then she told Grandma she couldn't take me and Grandma got loud." Rosie paused. "She said you were keeping family apart. She said I was being held from her. I asked quietly, 'Did you go with her?'" Rosie finally looked at me. "No," she said. "I told the office lady I didn't want to go, and she let me stay." 9 years old. A child who had been abandoned at a fair 2 weeks prior had the clarity and the courage to tell an adult no when the woman who abandoned her showed up at school trying to collect her like a package. I called the school. I had Phyllis removed from every list. I changed every emergency contact. I informed the principal that under no circumstances was anyone other than me or Walter to remove Rosie from the building. Then I called Walter at work. He came home in the middle of his shift. He didn't change clothes. He didn't eat. He drove straight to Phyllis's house, and I don't know what he said because I wasn't there, and he never told me the exact words. But when he came back 40 minutes later, he said it's done, and his voice was the voice of a man who had just performed surgery on his own family tree and wasn't going to apologize for the amputation. That night, Walter sat on the edge of Rosie's bed while she pretended to be asleep. He knew she was pretending because her breathing was too even, the way children breathe when they're controlling it. He said, quiet enough that it was just for her, "Nobody is taking you anywhere. Not from school. Not from home. Not from us. You are ours." Rosie's hand crept out from under the blanket and found his. She didn't open her eyes, but she held on. 2 months later, Walter came home with paperwork. Not a few pages, a stack. He set it on the kitchen table and said, "I want to adopt Rosie." I stared at him. We talked about it before, in the vague way you talk about things that feel too big to schedule. This wasn't vague. This was forms. This was signatures. This was real. Her biological father had been out of the picture since before she was born. His rights had been terminated by the court 2 years earlier. There was no legal barrier, just paperwork and patience, and a man who decided that a child who lined up her shoes by the door deserved a father who'd never let her be left on a bench again. Rosie found out about the adoption the way she found out about most things in our house, by accident and on her own terms. She was at the kitchen table drawing while Walter filled out forms, and she looked over and saw her name printed on an official document, and her pencil stopped. "What's that?" she said. Walter looked at her, then at me, then back at her. "These are adoption papers," he said simply. "If you want me to be your dad on paper, not just in the house, this is how we do it." Rosie stared at the paper. "Is this because of Grandma?" she asked. "No," Walter said without hesitating. "This is because of you. This is because you shouldn't ever have to wonder if you're staying." Rosie was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Will my name change?" "If you want it to," Walter said. Rosie looked at Captain sitting on the chair beside her, missing a tail and an ear, and held together by love and thread. "Can Captain's name change too?" she asked. "Captain can be whatever he wants," Walter said. Rosie nodded. Then she slid a drawing across the table. 3 stick figures. A house with a big door. A horse. Labels in crayon. Mama. Dad. Me. Captain. Walter took that drawing and put it inside the adoption folder like it was the most important document in the stack. Because it was. The adoption process took 11 months. Home visits from a social worker who checked our smoke detectors and asked Rosie questions in private, and wrote reports I wasn't allowed to read. Background checks. Letters from Rosie's teachers saying she was thriving. A letter from our neighbour, Mrs. Patterson, who wrote that Margaret and Walter loved that child like sunrise loves morning, which is the most beautiful sentence anyone has ever written about me, and I will take it to my grave. Phyllis tried one more time. She sent a letter to the court opposing the adoption. She claimed Walter was acting under my influence. She claimed Rosie was being isolated from family. She claimed she had a right to a relationship with her grandchild. The judge read the letter and set it aside. And it changed nothing because a woman who leaves a child on a bench doesn't get to claim rights to that child in a courtroom. The adoption was finalized on a Tuesday in August 1985. We drove to the courthouse in Walter's truck because it was the only vehicle we had, and Rosie sat between us on the bench seat, with Captain on her lap and her new shoes that actually fit because I'd measured twice, and a dress she'd picked herself, blue with small white flowers. Walter wore a jacket that was too warm for August and kept tugging the collar like it was trying to fight him. The courtroom was small. The judge was a woman named Judge Alice Brennan, who had grey hair and kind eyes and a voice that sounded like she'd spent her career choosing words carefully because she knew they mattered. She looked at Rosie and asked, "Do you understand what we're doing today?" Rosie nodded. "We're making it real," she said. Judge Brennan smiled. She looked at Walter. "Mr. Briggs, do you wish to adopt this child as your legal daughter?" Walter said, "Yes, ma'am," and his voice cracked on the second word and he cleared his throat, but he didn't look away. Judge Brennan asked Rosie one more question. "What do you want to say?" Rosie looked at Walter, then at me, then at Judge Brennan. Then she faced forward and said four words that I hear every single day of my life when I wake up and every single night when I close my eyes. "He already is my dad." Walter's eyes filled. He didn't wipe them. He just let them fill, and he breathed, and Judge Brennan stamped the paper, and the sound of that stamp was the sound of a door closing and a door opening at the exact same time. On the way out, Rosie didn't skip. She walked, steady, upright, shoulders back. She walked like a child who knew exactly where she was going because she finally knew exactly where she belonged. In the truck, she sat between us again, and she said, "My name is Rosie Briggs." Now and then she spelled it out loud, Briggs, like she was tasting each letter. Over the next week, she wrote her new name on everything. Notebooks, the inside of her shoes, the cover of every book she owned, the wall beside her bed in pencil so small you had to lean in to read it. Rosie Briggs, Rosie Briggs, Rosie Briggs. Like if she wrote it enough times, the world couldn't take it back. Phyllis and Darlene and Earl never met the new Rosie Briggs. They never attended another birthday. They never sat at another Thanksgiving table with us. They never saw Rosie graduate from high school or college, or walk down an aisle, or hold her own daughter for the first time. Phyllis died in 1999. I did not attend the funeral. Walter did. He went alone. He stood in the back. He didn't speak. He told me later that the only thing he felt was tired, like grief and relief had gotten tangled together and he couldn't separate them, so he just carried both. Rosie is 49 now. She teaches middle school English in a town not far from where we raised her. She has two daughters, Clara, who is 22, and Willa, who is 18. They call me Nana. They fight over Captain, who now lives on a shelf in Rosie's classroom, missing a tail and both ears, held together by 40 years of thread and love and the stubborn refusal to throw away something that once kept a child alive inside. Walter died 11 years ago, in his sleep, in our bed, in the house we bought together with the money we saved when we stopped sending $400 a month to people who didn't deserve a cent. He went the way he lived, quietly, without asking anyone to carry anything for him. I miss him the way you miss the floor when someone pulls it out from under you. Every day, in every step, in every room where his silence used to live and now just echoes. Rosie called me last Tuesday. She calls every Tuesday because Tuesday was the day the adoption was finalized, and she never forgot the day of the week. She said, "Mama, Willa asked me today why I keep Captain on my shelf at school." I said, "What did you tell her?" Rosie was quiet for a second. I told her that Captain was the first thing I ever owned that nobody took away. And then I told her about the bench, and the cotton candy, and the man who carried me through a fair because my ankle was broken and my grandmother didn't care. I held the phone and I didn't speak, because some things are too heavy for words and too important for silence, so you just sit in the middle and breathe. Rosie said one more thing before she hung up. She said, I wrote my name on Willa's birth certificate in the biggest letters they'd let me use, Briggs, because that name means someone chose me. And I want my daughters to know that being chosen is the strongest thing a person can be. I'm 72 years old. I'm sitting in this chair with a cup of tea that's gone cold and a heart that still works, even though it's been cracked and repaired so many times it's mostly glue and stubbornness. I've told you this story because it's true and because true stories are the only ones worth the time it takes to tell them. So here's what I want to know. And I'm asking because I'm old enough to have stopped pretending questions don't matter. Was Walter right to cut them off? Was I right to let him? Should we have given Phyllis another chance, a fifth chance, a fifth chance, a 15th? Or did we do the only thing that parents can do when the people who are supposed to love their child treat that child like a problem that walked in uninvited? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. I read them at night in this chair with my tea and my memories, and I think about all of you out there who have your own Rosies and your own Phyllises and your own benches where somebody left you sitting alone. And if this story hit you somewhere you weren't expecting, somewhere between the cotton candy and the courtroom, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button. This channel is full of stories like this one. Stories about people who got quiet and then got brave. Stories about children who were told they didn't belong and then were shown by one person that they did. If you haven't watched the other stories on this channel, go watch them. Every single one of them was written for someone like you. And if you've already watched them all, come back next time because the next story is the one that made my granddaughter Clara put her phone down and look at me across the kitchen table and say, Nana, you did not. But I did. I absolutely did. Take care of yourselves, hold your children, check their ankles, buy them cotton candy. And if anyone ever leaves your kid on a bench, don't smooth it over. Stand up, say something. And if they don't listen, walk out the door and don't look back. This is Margaret. I'll see you in the next one. Good night.